Hi, I'm Kaya Larke, and this is What Doesn't Kill Us. In 1988, the sea off Aberdeen in Scotland caught fire. A gas leak on the Piper Alpha oil rig caused a huge explosion that saw a fireball rip through the platform, killing 167 men in the world's deadliest oil rig disaster. 61 workers survived, many of them with severe burns and life-changing injuries. Joe Meanen was one of the lucky ones. He joins me to recall that awful day and how he survived more than 30 years ago. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about your story today.
You're welcome.
Now let's get into your sort of life on the oil rigs, sort of a little bit before the Piper Alpha disaster. You were quite young when you started working on the rigs, weren't you? What were you exactly sort of doing at the time, and what kind of drew you to that particular lifestyle?
Well, many years ago, I kind of moved away from home and lived in Jersey for a couple of years, just doing odd jobs. And in between that time, my parents had moved up to close to Aberdeen. And my dad started working up in the Shetland Islands when we were building the Sullenville oil terminal. And once I was coming back from Jersey, I had an accident playing football, so I'd lost my job there and everything. So he told us he could get me a job up in Sullenville oil terminal as a trainee scaffolder. So I started up there at 20 to learn my scaffolding trade. And once the completion of the oil terminal in about 1981, and the jobs were finished there, I started working offshore as a scaffolder offshore.
What was life like on the oil rigs in those kind of early days of your career? Because it's sort of weeks away from home at a time, isn't it? And then a few weeks back, and it's quite a different lifestyle to how many of us sort of live in our early 20s.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and away for 2 weeks at a time, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And you maybe I've heard people speaking about rigs and platforms and that, but nothing really prepares you till you get on that chopper and go way out yourself and experience it for the first time yourself. Yeah, it's a real eye opener.
And just describe for me, what is it like that first time? I mean, even I imagine just being on that helicopter for the first time must be sort of quite exciting and quite a little bit of adrenaline. But as you kind of flying out over the sea and you actually get that first sort of real glimpse of this huge platform out in the sea, what's that like? Can you remember that? Can you describe that for me?
Yeah, just sometimes you'll maybe you were flying out. Can't exactly remember the first time, but sometimes you stop at another platform to let some other workers off or whatever that were joining that platform, and yes, it's quite amazing sight to see, and how the engineering and how they've managed to get these structures out in the middle of the North Sea. It's a real eye opener, and it's amazing. Amazing experience, quite scary also, and if you're a bit green or you're a green hand, you're just kind of following on and hoping somebody takes you under their wing and looks after you.
And if I can just take you to sort of July 1988 now it wasn't your first time on the Piper Alpha platform, was it, back in that summer?
No, I started in March of that year, early March. So when July came round, that was my 5th trip on Piper Alpha. So I wasn't brand new on there.
Yeah. Now, the night of the Piper Alpha disaster, it was a calm summer's night. When did you realise initially that something had gone badly wrong, that something was going wrong?
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't. It was very, very busy at the time. They were having what they call a shutdown, but it was only really a partial shutdown of Piper.
On that particular night, it's you know, it's July, it's quite calm at sea, and you weren't actually sort of working at that particular moment, were you? What were you doing kind of before you realised that something was actually going wrong?
Uh, well, on that day, like you say, it was a beautiful summer's night. You often get that offshore in the middle of summer. Sea was almost flat calm that day. We had worked a 15-hour shift. We were coming to the end of our 2-week rotation. We only had one more shift to do on a Thursday, and we would have been travelling home on the Friday. We knew there was Caddyshack on the movies that night, just after 9 o'clock. So we decided, right, well, there was a few years went up there, the guys that all worked together. So we headed up to the movie, the cinema at just at 9 o'clock. We just finished work at 9 o'clock. So quick change into our casual clothes and up to the cinema room.
And you're just sat there sort of relaxing, watching this 80s comedy, chilling out with your workmates. Completely oblivious, really, weren't you, to kind of what was then going on elsewhere on the platform?
Yeah, kind of would finish our shift and watch the movie, so you switched off, you know, just relaxing. And about 45 minutes or so into the movie, we were sitting there in the cinema. It was really quite busy because it was quite a popular movie. And there was these really high-pitched sounds coming from outside, like a jet engine, you know, really revving up hard. There was a silence came over the cinema, and all the guys kind of looked at each other, and that doesn't sound particularly good. But then it just subsided again. But then about 3 or 4 minutes later, it started up again, but even more intense. And same again, a silence came over the cinema. But all of a sudden, there was a huge explosion, and part of the roof of the cinema caved in. But suspended ceilings and that, but some of the lights came down. There was a initial panic because the whole platform rocked back and forward. You know, it was just like being inside a big drum or something like that. And
that must have been absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, it was a shock to a lot of people. And let's say there was a initial panic, and then because there was only really kind of one entrance in and out. Then we got, right, guys, calm down, you know, let's get out, you know, orderly. And we started moving out the cinema into the accommodation area. But there'd been no alarms that went off at all. No tannoys to let people know what was happening. Unbeknown to us, the initial explosion totally destroyed the control room. And that was kind of where everything would have been organised from, and the alarms and such like. But the control room was totally destroyed in the initial explosion.
So there was with that control room down, there was no way of sort of centrally kind of communicating with all of you on the platform then at that point?
That's right, yeah. And our first initial thoughts was to head to our lifeboats and through the accommodation, because that's normally once a week you would get a lifeboat drill, and you'd go to your lifeboats and your manifest would get ticked off, and everybody accountable for. But it soon became quite evident with the huge thick black oil smoke that there was no chance of getting to the lifeboats, because the lifeboats were all at the northern end of the platform, which was towards the accommodation end. You went over the west side of the platform as guys coming back from there saying no chance to get to the lifeboats. Across the east side of the platform, not saying there, no chance to get to the lifeboats, it's too bad.
So where was the cinema sort of on? I mean, you're kind of referring to the kind of the northeast, west. Where was the cinema within the platform?
Cinema was more over to the east side of the platform, and it kind of, there was a short corridor to get into the accommodation.
So when you actually when you sort of clambered through this kind of ceiling coming down and this debris, and you actually kind of get outside of that cinema initially, what can you see? I mean, can you see anything? Is the air just full of thick black smoke? I mean, what were your kind of visuals once you got out?
Couldn't really see much because we just tried to, you know, just through kind of instinct, went to go and to try and get to the lifeboats first. But yeah, I'd never really got outside at all at that point. And then after, you know, finding out that we couldn't get to our lifeboats, when you've done your offshore training, you're always told your first method of evacuation from the platform would be by helicopter. So we just kind of elevated up. I got separated from the guys I was with in the cinema, my workmates and everything, and just kind of see me elevate up to the Galley area, which was just below the heli deck.
So you're just sort of thinking, if there's any helicopters going to come in, I'm going to get myself up there near the helipad so that I can get the hell out of here.
Yeah. And that was supposed to be a secure, airtight location also. But once I got up there, and kind of, when I got up there, there must have been about 100 men up in the cinema. And there was an eerie silence there in the cinema. There wasn't much getting said at all.
And just to give some context, when you're saying there's 100 men sort of up there, and there was 226 of you on the platform on that day, wasn't it? So
yes,
there's about half of you at this point.
There, yeah. I think there was about 60 men working night shift that night, 60 to 70 men working, you know, because the platform ran 24 hours. So, divers were all working that night as well. So, but
you've got yourself up near to the sort of just below the heli deck, and what's the space there? Where have you kind of got yourself to at this point?
Yeah, really into the sitting area of the galley, seating there for about 80 folk. You know, it would go, you know, you'd get your time slot to go into the galley. So there was always, you know, room for people in a rotation coming in and out. Like I say, there must have been about 100, maybe just over 100 men there, but there was not much getting said. You know, it was pretty quiet. The OIM and the safety officer was there. Somebody asked them what was happening, what we're going to do. They said there'd been a mayday sent out, which there had been. We found out later on had been a mayday sent out from the radio room by the radio operator, and he said there would be helicopters on their way to pick us up, just to stay fast in the Galley area.
And the OIM, what's that role?
Offshore installation manager.
Okay, so essentially the guy in charge, the one who you're going to look up to in the lack of any kind of tannoys coming out or anything like that. This is the guy who's sort of in command, basically. Yes,
that's right, like a captain of a ship.
Yeah.
At that point, we could hear other small explosions happening outside, and the emergency lighting had went off, but you could also hear, like, you know, the structure that groaning, like bending metal, and not realizing at the time, but I think that already at that point the structure of the platform was being compromised. You know, it was starting to give way and melt, you know, and weaken. So we didn't realize that, but then the smoke was getting more intense also, so you could hear windows breaking and stuff like that. Emergency light had gone off. Also, the guys that were there says they were all sitting with wet towels over their mouths and noses, and they says to me, "Joe, go, there's towels up there, go and get one and soak it." But when I went up in the big industrial sinks and I turned the tap on, there was no water. And then I started realizing that there's no power on the platform. You know, there's nothing. There should be a deluge system working on the platform to, you know, to dampen down these fires and that. And if there's no water, there's no power.
So at this point, yeah, the electricity's out, the lights have gone out, there's no water. I mean, what were you thinking at this point? I mean, you know, it's listening to you describe it. I mean, it's like something out of a disaster movie, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just, it's hard to imagine the fear you must have been feeling, and the noises and the sounds and the smells that were going on around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's correct, and I think it was slowly sinking into me, my realization that, you know, we're in a really bad situation here. I don't know if my reaction beforehand was just, you know, kidding on myself that it wasn't, you know, this wasn't really happening, you know, but it took a wee, and this is only maybe 10 minutes after the initial explosion, so there's not a lot of time to think in that either. But at that point, let us say, the smoke was getting worse, and one of the things with smoke inhalation is you don't realise how much smoke you are breathing in. So at that point, let's say there was 20 of us there, and we says, well, look, we're sitting here, and if anything else happens on the platform, we're not in a position to, if we're inside like this, to be able to do anything for ourselves. Why don't we go up onto the heli deck, and maybe we'll be able to see for ourselves more. If there is anything else that happens, we'll be able to do something for ourselves. So at that point, kind of, we agreed, right, we'll go. So at that point, we got up as far as we could, up onto the heli deck, and there was a converted container there, which was the radio room, and it was also the heli deck landing officers area office up there. So we climbed up on top of there. That was as high as we could get at that area of the platform. And as soon as we got outside, we realised how bad. It was the first kind of real time we could get a bigger picture of what was happening and how really bad the situation was.
So what could you see at that point once you actually got up there? What could you actually see?
Yeah, we could see lots of burning areas down on the pipe deck, which was kind of behind us to the south of us. But really this thick black acrid oil-fired smoke, you know, which was really, really bad. And when we got up as high as we could, we were quite fortunate as the smoke was coming from underneath the platform and kind of going up around the sides, but it was spreading in towards us as well. But it was kind of coming across in layers. And we were all up on top of this converted container, and we could see when there was a gap coming in between the layers of smoke. So we'd get up and catch some breaths of fresh air. Also, the Tharos, which was a firefighting vessel, accommodation vessel, and had a small hospital on it as well, was alongside for extra accommodation for when the shutdown was on. And they had a water cannon on the top of one of their crane jibs, and that was fanning back and forward. And that was actually, we were catching the water from this water cannon. And that made a big difference to us. Once the riser from the tartan fractured, like 30,000 tons per second of gas that was ignited.
So how did you escape?
Yeah, well, after the riser from the tartan fractured, he didn't really know exactly what had happened, but he just knew something horrific had happened, you know. So I actually, at that point, there was maybe 12, 14 years, everybody just seemed to disappear, and I didn't know where everybody went. And then I run across to this radio mast, which was at the side of one of the emergency heli deck, and it must have been panic. I got onto that and started climbing up that. At that point, I realised I'm doing the wrong thing, because the higher I was getting up, the more intense the heat was getting.
Yeah.
And then I kind of almost slipped in. And then at that point, I thought, I just said to myself, well, that's me, I'm dead here. For some, I can't really explain it, something took over what I was doing. Don't know whether it was will to survive or something of a higher being, but I just come down that radial mast to the deck below, the heli deck, run along to the access stairs that would take you up on the heli deck, run across the north side of the platform, could see the water because the explosion had cleared all the smoke away. Had a life jacket on by this time, took the life jacket off, threw it in front of me, took a few steps back, and although I knew exactly what I was doing, it was as if something else was in control of what I was doing. And then I took a run, and there's safety netting around the heli deck and the supports. I launched myself off as far as I could, and it was only really at that point I came back to myself, and the first thought came into my head was, what the fuck have I done? Because I knew, and then it was roughly about 7 seconds.
And that thought comes into your mind when you're kind of midair. You've sort of launched yourself off, and you're like, okay, well, what happens now?
Yeah. And not another thought came into my head, because it took about 7 seconds to cover the distance, which was 175 feet to reach the water. And not another thought came into my head. But when I hit the water, I knew I'd hit the water. And then the main target was to get back up to the surface after that. I have no idea how far I went down or anything, but I managed to get back up to the surface. And,
I mean, jumping from 170 feet, I mean, you must have gone a long way down, mustn't you? Once you'd hit the surface. I mean, can you remember kind of trying to sort of get back up to the surface? I mean, did you think at that point, like, I've got myself off the platform, but now I'm still a goner? Because or kind of, are you just sort of not really? Is it just that will to survive that kind of kicks in at that point?
I think it was, and all I could, my focus was get back to the surface. You could actually see the light above you from, like the flames. It was, so I remember that, head up that way to the light. I mean, it's difficult to explain how it all happened.
I mean, you were saying sort of you kind of remember sort of looking up when you're under the water and that the light above you, because essentially the sea is just on fire, isn't it? So I mean, coming up, so you've kind of got yourself off the platform, over this safety net, you're in the water, you've gone however far down below the surface, you're kicking your way back up. But actually, the reality is that once you get back up onto the surface, you're going to be surrounded by flames. So, I mean, what kind of, how did you then kind of survive? So it's not over, is it? You've got yourself off the platform, but then you're in the middle of the sea on fire around you.
And that's very true. You think, maybe got away from the worst of it, but you're still, and obviously I just had tracksuit bottoms on, and I polo shirts. So you're not, the water's only 5 degrees or so, so the hypothermia, maybe, if you were in the water for any kind of length of time. So at that point, when I got back to the surface, lo and behold, there's a life jacket floating in the water beside me, so I presume it must have been the one I had thrown over.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was also, that was the north side of the platform, and that's where all the lifeboats were stationed at. But during one of the explosions, a lifeboat must have been blown off the platform, and there was parts of the wreckage of that in the water. So I managed to wedge my hand in between this other parts of the lifeboat. It was floating, and let's say it was a really lovely summer's day, and which went in my favour was the water that the sea was running from south to north that night, so it was a light swell, only about half a metre, and it was drifting to the north, so it was taking me away from the platform. So that was helping as well, So as I started propelling myself away, the way the sea was running that night was taking me away from the platform as well. So I managed to get away quite quickly.
So I mean, really, if you'd have jumped off another side of the platform, you might have actually been carried back
under the platform. Yeah, that's right.
So you've got yourself sort of into this lifeboat that's kind of been blown off the platform, and then I mean, how long have you got any sense of kind of how long you were drifting for? How were you then kind of rescued from there?
Yeah, well, it wasn't too long, because let's say I was in the water and I was propelling myself away, and the actual rest of this lifeboat was floating in the sea, maybe 20 yards, 25 yards away. So
can you see anyone else in the water at this point?
No, I never seen anybody. Yeah, there's a lot of debris in the water. So I just disregarded the stuff I had, and I swam over to this lifeboat that was floating in the water. Managed to pull myself up into the lifeboat, and I was looking back at the platform. I was really trying to take in what I was looking at, and I just couldn't believe what was happening. But also at that point, because I had a short sleeve t-shirt on, and I noticed I had these huge blisters on my arms, and I couldn't figure out why that had happened. But just at that time also, there was a fast rescue craft, because there was quite a few boats and ships in that area that night, and from one of the supply boats, they launched a fast rescue craft as well, and that was heading over to the lifeboat anyway. So they managed to get me into that, and they asked me if there was anybody else in the lifeboat. I said no, and they lay me down the side of this fast rescue craft, and kind of at that point, I knew I was safe, and then my adrenaline was starting to dissipate, and that's when my injuries started to take effect on me, and kind of from then for about the next, I don't know how long it was, an hour or whatever, I was kind of in and out of consciousness. I just remember little bits. I remember them take me back to their supply boat, which is a flat-bedded boats at the back, and getting put into a stretcher and then getting winched onto the boat.
How much pain? I mean, you're sort of saying, obviously, adrenaline is your friend in that situation, isn't it? Because it kind of protects you from feeling that pain. Once that adrenaline had started to dissipate, how much pain were you in?
Yeah. I can't really remember too much about it till they got me on, and I think at that point, till they got me onto the Tharos and in the hospital, the medical facilities there, I think I was starting to go into shock at that point. And I just remember one of the medics or doctors just saying, just give him a shot of morphine. And I could remember getting it in the left side of my bum, and I could just feel it spreading across my body. And I don't know how big a shot it was of morphine, but once I'd got that, everything just seemed to calm down, and
it did the trick.
Yeah, it did the trick for sure. Yeah.
And how long? I mean, well, so what were the extent of your injuries then? I mean, you sort of talked about these blisters.
Yeah.
And obviously, when you'd left the platform, when you jumped off the platform, you were okay. You were injury free.
Yeah.
So, what were the extent of your injuries, and what had actually happened?
Well, kind of multitudes of injuries. I remember getting back to Aberdeen on a helicopter into the casualty there, and then they took me up to the burns ward. So yeah, it between the injuries from the fall and injuries from the burns, I was quite a bad way for.
Those blisters had come, hadn't they, from when you'd actually sort of the heat essentially that you had kind of jumped through, coming from the flames as you jumped off that platform.
That's right. What happened was, once we few weeks in hospital, 3-4 weeks, and the surgeons came around, and we were having a chat or whatever, and talking about what had happened, and it kind of worked out because they thought, well, there was no charring of skin, it was blisters I had. It couldn't have been in any direct contact with flames. And we kind of, when I went through my story, they says, well, it's probably happened during your fall, and where your bare skin was exposed, and it was just heat radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately enough, like I say, I do believe if it wasn't for our clothes getting soaked with the water from that water cannon from the Tharos, and I actually had a real good head of hair at the time, so my hair was all soaking wet as well. I do believe that saves me from getting more badly burnt at the time, just that little bit of protection with your clothes being wet and my hair being wet. But unfortunately, I had a short sleeve shirt on that night, and that's where, because the temperatures they were at thousands of degrees hot. They were like, and that's where the burn injuries came from, and the surgeons told me that what they described it as full thickness burns. So I had to, take the skin off right down to my flesh on certain parts of my arms, Also, which was quite scary when we seen the physio coming round, and she came round to get. I didn't even believe how much black stuff she came round to get the black smoke, or what I'd inhaled, so when she came round to clear my lungs, and I had these chest injuries as well, or body injuries, it was really tough. But I couldn't, it's like if you've got a cold and you've got guitar, and it was harder than I'd spitting that back out to clear my lungs, and I actually couldn't believe how much yuck came out,
And I mean, you were in hospital for a few weeks. How long did it kind of take you for your arms to heal, for you to kind of then be sort of better, or to kind of recover?
About just over 6 weeks in the hospital. I was quite fortunate, like I said, didn't live too far from Aberdeen, so I was kind of going back every day, Monday to Friday, for a couple of weeks, and then it was every other day and such. But it was probably over a year. So I had to get quite a bit of physio on my arms, because when you get skin grafts, the skin shrinks, and I had to get mobility back in my hands and that. So I had quite a bit of physiotherapy. That was quite painful, and people will know that I've had any kind of skin graft or anything. It's actually your donor areas. It's the most painful parts that So, but I was just so lucky. I just felt so lucky to be alive. It just seemed to keep me going and get me through everything that I had to get through.
Did you ever go back to work on the oil platforms
No,
after?
No. That was enough for me. I decided I wasn't going back again.
I'm not surprised. But in terms of actually that kind of full recovery, I mean, do you ever get over being in a disaster like that? I mean, what have been the kind of the ongoing, the long-term scars, the long-term impact from being on Piper Alpha that night?
I consider myself very fortunate that I wasn't that badly affected psychologically wise. Afterwards, I was just so happy to be alive. But I know certainly a lot of people were more severely affected psychologically, and had a very, very bad time. And like my mate Billy, who survived, he went through a number of years. It was always there, and his thoughts, all the time. I was fortunate and never, but it's something that obviously never go away. But I also was never shy of talking about it. I always thought, well, let's face up to this, and it's happened. You kind of not say it happened or try to, ignore that it happened.
You were quite young when it happened. How did it change you?
I kind of thought it changed me a little bit more positively, to grasp this second chance. I know my first Christmas in '88 was really bad. And Christmas Day, had my own flat in Stonehaven at the time, and that morning of Christmas Day, I just sat in my settee and just cried, because all I could think about was the families and mostly the kids that wouldn't have their fathers that day, and like the mums and dads that couldn't have their sons that day. But then I kind of had to think to myself, well, can I carry on like that? It was and I says, well, which was quite simplistic. I just says to myself, well, if I hadn't survived, and some of the other guys, that never survived, did survive, I says I would want them to make take the full benefit of being a survivor and live their life as full as they could. And that was kind of my attitude, and that's how I progressed with it, and I carried on from there, but it will never go away, obviously, till the day I die, but I do talks, and and I'll if process safety people want to hear my story. It's worked quite well up till now. I've only been doing it about 3 years, but I do get a great deal of good feedback for that, and it's quite rewarding.
And what has life been like for you since the Piper Alpha disaster? What you say you sort of sat that Christmas Day and sort of thought, do you know what, actually I need to live my life for all of those who can't, who won't. What adventures have you been on? What kind of things? What have been the highlights for you of your last 30 years?
Highlights, I went away to Australia, and actually my sister and her friend went at the same time. They went for a couple of years actually, and a working holiday. Met up with them, met up with a lot of great relatives I never knew I had in Australia, and also had family in Zimbabwe. So I went to see them as well. I went to Southern Africa as well, South Africa, which I thought was an absolutely beautiful country. And I probably would never have been able to do these things, if I obviously got personal compensation for what I went through. And I probably would never have been able to do a lot of that things if I hadn't got that money from my own personal compensation. But it was fantastic. Done a few safaris, and whitewater rafting down the Zambezi. Also went to a world title boxing match in Las Vegas in 1989. Just went myself, and obviously there was no internet in them days, and I didn't know how to go about trying to get a ticket. So what I done was I wrote a letter to the manager of the Caesars Palace at Las Vegas. I knew that's where the fight was going to be. And I got a great letter back from him. It was like a scroll, you know, like, because it's the Roman Caesar's palace and that. And
Amazing.
Just gave me the phone number, and I phoned them up, and I got a ticket for it. Like,
fantastic.
So, yeah, it was.
Love
it. Was
it.
great,
So
yeah.
just ticking off some of the crazy things from the bucket list, just to live life to the full.
Yeah, absolutely. And very fortunate I can do that. Like,
so in between some of the business ventures that you've sort of done along the way, and the and the adventures of sort of all of your travels, what's left on the bucket list? What's the thing that you'd like to do next when the world kind of opens up fully again and we get back to normal?
Mm-hmm. I would like to go. I've been in New York before, but that was before the Twin Towers, and I'd really like to go because I've seen a couple of podcasts with survivors of the Twin Towers and that, and the fire station that's down in Lower Manhattan, and they've got a memorial at the Twin Towers area there. I'd like to go and see that,
Do you feel some kind of affiliation, if that's the right word, with sort of people who have experienced and survived or not survived these sort of major disasters, major world events?
Yeah, I think, and some of the stories I've seen being told, and you think, oh, I know what they're speaking about there.
Yeah.
Or, it's not everything, because even on paper, 61 survivors, we've all got a different kind of story to tell, but there's a certain things
commonality,
that are similar,
but
everybody's got a slightly different story. But when I've seen things, and I'm sure if I spoke to somebody that had survived, or wasn't even involved in some of these other disasters that have happened, there would be some kind of common ground that we'd be able to say, oh, okay, with it even saying something, you say, oh, yeah, I know what you're speaking about there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Joe, thank you so much for sharing your story with me today, and I hope you get to do many more things on the bucket list. And thank you for sharing your story and showing that what doesn't kill us really does make us stronger.
You're welcome.
And if you're interested in Joe talking to your business or in hearing more of his story, then you can connect with him on LinkedIn. Now, the podcast was recognised this month at the .com Awards, an international competition recognising excellence in digital communications. So a huge thank you to all the guests who have appeared so far. It means so much to have my work honoured in this way. Now, you can find out more about the podcast by following along on Instagram and Facebook as well at What Doesn't Kill Us Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe on your favourite platform, leave a review, and tell your friends and family about it too. It's really hard building an audience when you're a new podcast, so your help really does matter. Thank you.